The spit hit Jeremiah Blackwood's cheek like a burning brand, sliding down his weathered face to drip onto the dusty courthouse steps of Redemption Creek, Colorado territory. The crowd's jeers echoed off the sandstone buildings, a chorus of hatred that would have broken a lesser man. But Jeremiah stood firm, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the face of Judge Cornelius Hartwell as the verdict rang out across the scorching August afternoon of 1867. Not guilty by reason of self-defense, Judge Hartwell announced, his voice cutting through the mob's fury like a blade through silk. The defendant, Solomon Washington, is hereby freed of all charges. Behind Jeremiah, Solomon Washington, a freed slave from Georgia who'd traveled west seeking the promise of equality that the frontier supposedly offered, collapsed to his knees, tears streaming down his dark face. 3 months in redemption, Creek's hellish jail had left him gaunt and hollow-eyed, but alive. Barely. "This is an outrage," bellowed Augustus Crenshaw, the town's wealthiest landowner and the dead man's employer. His face was purple with rage, spittle flying from his lips, as he jabbed a fat finger toward Jeremiah. "That nigger killed a white man, and this half-breed lawyer thinks he can twist the law to set him free." The slur hit Jeremiah like a physical blow, but he'd heard worse. His Cherokee mother and Irish father had given him features that marked him as an outsider in both worlds, too dark for white society, too pale for the tribes. In a territory where blood quantum determined your place in the social order, Jeremiah Blackwood existed in the dangerous space between worlds. Solomon Washington defended himself against an armed attacker, Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd learned law not in fancy Eastern schools, but in the hard crucible of frontier justice. Thomas Brennan drew first, threatened his life, and got exactly what he deserved. The crowd surged forward like a living thing, hatred radiating from them in waves. Men who'd never spoken to Solomon, who knew nothing of his character or his story, bayed for his blood simply because his skin was dark, and their world was built on the fiction that such differences mattered more than the content of a man's heart. "String them both up," someone shouted from the back. "Nigger lover and his pet." Sheriff Dutch Morrison, a mountain of a man whose loyalty had been bought and paid for by Augustus Crenshaw years ago, made no move to control the crowd. His pale eyes met Jeremiah's with undisguised contempt. "You've made your point, Blackwood," Morrison drawled, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "Now get your client out of my town before something unfortunate happens." But Jeremiah didn't move. Something in the sheriff's tone, in the way Crenshaw's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction, told him this wasn't over. In a town where justice was bought and sold like cattle, a legal victory meant nothing if you couldn't live to enjoy it. "We'll leave when we're ready, Sheriff," Jeremiah said quietly. "The law says Solomon is a free man. That means he goes where he pleases, when he pleases." Morrison's face darkened. "The law also says accidents happen to folks who don't know their place." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, feeding off each other's hatred until the very air seemed to vibrate with violence. Jeremiah could see it building, the moment when words would give way to action, when the thin veneer of civilization would crack and reveal the savage beast beneath. That's when he saw her. Elizabeth Hartwell, the judge's daughter, stood at the edge of the crowd like a vision from another world. Her auburn hair caught the late afternoon sun, turning it to flame, and her green eyes held a mixture of admiration and concern that made Jeremiah's heart skip a beat. She was 25, educated back east, and completely off limits to a man like him. But for 3 months she'd been the only white person in Redemption Creek to speak to him with anything approaching respect. Elizabeth pushed through the crowd with the confidence that came from being the judge's daughter. Her blue dress a splash of color in the sea of dusty brown and black. When she reached Jeremiah's side, she did something that shocked the mob into momentary silence. She took his arm. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courthouse steps. "My father would like to speak with you and Mr. Washington privately. There are complications you should know about." The crowd's roar of disapproval was deafening. A white woman touching a half-breed publicly was scandalous enough, but defending him was social suicide. Jeremiah started to pull away, knowing what her gesture would cost her, but Elizabeth's grip tightened. "Let them talk," she whispered fiercely. "Some things matter more than reputation." They made their way through the hostile crowd like swimmers, fighting against a riptide. Someone threw a rock that grazed Jeremiah's shoulder. Another voice shouted something so vile about Elizabeth that Solomon actually growled, his hands clenching into fists despite his weakened condition. "Easy," Jeremiah murmured. "We're not out of this yet." Judge Hartwell's office was a sanctuary of books and legal documents, the walls lined with law texts that represented civilization's thin bulwark against chaos. But the judge himself looked like a man who'd aged a decade in the past few hours, his gray hair disheveled and his usually immaculate appearance rumpled. "Close the door," he said without preamble. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room." Jeremiah helped Solomon into a chair, noting how the freed slave's hands shook with exhaustion and malnutrition. 3 months of Sheriff Morrison's hospitality had nearly killed him. "Judge, I appreciate," Jeremiah began. "Thomas Brennan wasn't just some drifter looking for trouble," Hartwell interrupted. "He was Augustus Crenshaw's enforcer, sent to intimidate Solomon into signing over his mining claim." The words hit Jeremiah like a punch to the gut. "What mining claim?" Hartwell moved to his desk, pulling out a folder thick with documents. 3 months ago, Solomon filed a claim on 40 acres up in Devil's Canyon. Standard procedure, all legal and proper. But 2 weeks later, Crenshaw filed a competing claim on the same land, alleging prior discovery. "That's impossible," Jeremiah said. "Solomon's claim has precedence. Unless Solomon can't defend it," Elizabeth said quietly. "Father, show him. The geological survey." Hartwell spread out a map marked with geological notations and survey stakes. The 40 acres in question sat at the confluence of 2 streams, with mineral deposits marked in red ink throughout the area. "Gold?" Jeremiah asked. "More than gold," Hartwell said grimly. "Silver, copper, and what the survey team thinks might be the largest concentration of precious metals this side of the Comstock lode. Conservative estimates put the value at over $2 million. Solomon's chair creaked as he leaned forward, his dark eyes widening. $2 million? For that little patch of ground? That little patch of ground could make whoever controls it the richest man in Colorado territory, Hartwell confirmed. Which is why Augustus Crenshaw wants it so badly, and why he was willing to have you killed for it. The room fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Outside, they could hear the crowd still milling about, their voices a low rumble of discontent. "There's more," Elizabeth said softly. "Father, tell them about the federal contract." Hartwell sighed heavily. "The Union Pacific Railroad is planning a spur line through Devil's Canyon. They need those mineral rights to finance the construction. Whoever controls that land won't just be rich, they'll control the economic future of this entire region." Jeremiah felt the pieces clicking into place like the chambers of a revolver. So Crenshaw sends his enforcer to intimidate Solomon into signing over his claim. When that doesn't work, Brennan escalates to violence, figuring a dead black man's claim won't hold up in court. Except Solomon fought back, Hartwell nodded. Killed Brennan in self-defense, just like you proved in court today. But now Crenshaw's in a bind. He can't file his fraudulent counterclaim while Solomon's alive to dispute it, but he can't have him killed outright without drawing federal attention. So he'll arrange an accident, Elizabeth said. A lynching made to look like frontier justice. The mob disperses, Solomon's dead, and Crenshaw files his claim the next morning. Solomon was staring at his hands, the weight of the revelation settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. $2 million, he whispered. "I was just looking for a place to pan for gold. Maybe make enough to buy a little farm somewhere. I never thought—" "You thought you could stake a claim like any other man," Jeremiah said firmly, "and you can. The law doesn't care about the color of your skin, even if the people enforcing it do. Doesn't it?" Solomon looked up, his eyes hollow with 3 months of brutality and a lifetime of oppression. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate everything you've done, but maybe it ain't worth dying for. Maybe I should just sign the papers and walk away." With what? Jeremiah demanded. You think Crenshaw's going to let you live after what you know? You think that mob outside is going to forget your face? There's no walking away from this, Solomon. There's only fighting or dying. Elizabeth moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the crowd below. They're not dispersing. If anything, there are more of them now. Hartwell joined her at the window, his face grim. Words spreading. Crenshaw's probably buying drinks for anyone willing to join his cause. How? Long until they storm the building? Jeremiah asked. An hour, maybe 2 if we're lucky. Sheriff Morrison won't hold them off. He's probably organizing them. Jeremiah's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending in violence and death. They could try to sneak out the back, but Crenshaw would have men watching every exit. They could barricade themselves in the courthouse, but that would only delay the inevitable. Or, Judge, what would it take to get federal protection for Solomon? A formal complaint alleging violation of his civil rights under the 14th Amendment, Hartwell said immediately. But that would require evidence of conspiracy, not just local prejudice. We have evidence, Elizabeth said suddenly. Father, show them the letter. Hartwell hesitated, then moved to his safe, withdrawing a single sheet of paper with a broken wax seal. This arrived by courier yesterday, addressed to Sheriff Morrison. It was misdirected to my office. Jeremiah read the letter, his anger building with each word. It was from a federal mining inspector, detailing the geological survey and confirming the massive mineral deposits on Solomon's claim. At the bottom, in Augustin Crenshaw's unmistakable handwriting, was a note. Handle the nigger problem permanently. No loose ends. AC. This is conspiracy to commit murder, Jeremiah said. And federal mail fraud. We could... The sound of breaking glass cut him off. Outside, the crowd had found their courage and rocks were flying at the courthouse windows. Voices shouted for them to come out and face justice. Time's up, Hartwell said grimly. Elizabeth, get to the back room and bar the door. I'm not hiding while you 3 face this alone, she said firmly. You'll face it dead if you stay here, her father replied. This isn't about law anymore, it's about mob rule. The front door exploded inward, and Sheriff Morrison entered with a dozen armed men behind him. His badge caught the lamplight as he smiled coldly at the room's occupants. Well, well, Morrison drawled. Looks like our legal eagles are planning to roost here for the night. Sheriff, Judge Hartwell said with all the authority he could muster, I order you to disperse that mob and protect these men. Morrison laughed, a sound like gravel in a tin can. I'm afraid I can't do that, Judge. See, the good people of Redemption Creek have lost faith in your interpretation of justice. They've asked me to correct the situation. By lynching an innocent man? Jeremiah stepped forward, putting himself between Solomon and the armed men. By giving Thomas Brennan the justice he deserves, Morrison replied. You may have fooled the judge with your fancy legal talk, but the people know what really happened. That boy killed a white man in cold blood, and now he's going to pay. Solomon Washington defended himself against an armed attack, Jeremiah said. We have witnesses. We have a dead white man and a living nigger. Morrison cut him off. That's all the evidence we need. The sheriff's men spread out through the office, their weapons trained on the small group. Behind them, Jeremiah could see the mob pressing closer, their faces twisted with bloodlust and alcohol. Mr. Blackwood, Solomon said quietly. Maybe it's time you stopped fighting my battles for me. What are you saying? Solomon stood slowly, his body still weak but his voice growing stronger. I'm saying maybe it's time I fought my own. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded document, yellowed with age and worn from handling. Sheriff Morrison, you want to talk about justice? Let's talk about real justice. What's that supposed to be? Morrison demanded. Solomon unfolded the document with careful hands. This is my father's manumission papers, signed by Colonel James Whitmore of Georgia in 1863. It also grants him, and his heirs, full rights to 40 acres of land in Colorado Territory, payment for 20 years of faithful service. The room went dead silent. Even the mob outside seemed to sense that something important was happening. My father was Colonel Whitmore's personal servant for 30 years, Solomon continued, his voice gaining strength. Saved the colonel's life twice. Once from a bear, once from Confederate raiders. When the colonel died, he left instructions that my family should receive land out west, where we could be truly free. Judge Hartwell took the document with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the legal language. My God, he whispered. This is legitimate, signed, witnessed, and recorded in the Georgia State Archives. What's it mean? Morrison demanded. It means, Jeremiah said, understanding flooding through him, that Solomon didn't file a claim on that land. He already owned it. That mining claim Crenshaw filed is worthless. Elizabeth gasped. Father, if this document predates Crenshaw's claim, then Augustine Crenshaw is guilty of fraud, attempted theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. Hartwell finished. This isn't just a local matter anymore. This is federal. Morrison's face went white. That's impossible. No nigger owns land No slave owns land, Jeremiah corrected. But Solomon Washington is a free man whose legal rights were established before he ever set foot in Colorado territory. And those rights are protected by the federal government. The sheriff's men exchanged nervous glances. Killing a freed slave was one thing. The federal government might investigate, but probably wouldn't pursue it too vigorously. But murdering a legitimate landowner whose rights were backed by federal documentation? That was the kind of crime that brought federal marshals and territorial governors running. You're bluffing, Morrison said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. That's when they heard the sound that changed everything. Horses, lots of them, approaching at a gallop. Through the broken windows they could see dust clouds rising from the main road into town. Expecting company, Sheriff? Jeremiah asked with a cold smile. Morrison rushed to the window, his face going even paler when he saw what was approaching. Jesus Christ, he whispered. A column of federal cavalry was riding hard toward Redemption Creek, their blue uniforms unmistakable in the fading light. At their head rode a man in civilian clothes whose bearing and escort marked him as someone very important indeed. That, Judge Hartwell said with growing amazement, is Governor Samuel Crawford. The mob outside began to scatter like leaves before a storm. Even the most alcohol-fueled racist had enough sense to know that attacking a federal official was a hanging offense. Governor Crawford dismounted with the fluid grace of a career military man, his gray hair and weathered face marking him as someone who'd seen the elephant and lived to tell about it. Behind him, 24 federal cavalrymen took positions around the courthouse, their presence transforming the dynamic in an instant. The governor's voice carried clearly as he addressed the dispersing crowd. Citizens of Redemption Creek, I'm here on urgent federal business. Any man who interferes with that business will be arrested and tried for treason. I suggest you return to your homes and contemplate the error of your ways. Moments later, Crawford entered the courthouse office, his keen eyes taking in the scene. The broken windows, the armed men, the obvious tension. When his gaze fell on Solomon's manumission papers, still clutched in Judge Hartwell's hands, his expression shifted to one of intense interest. Governor Crawford, Jeremiah said formally, I'm Jeremiah Blackwood, attorney for Solomon Washington. We have evidence of a federal crime. So I've been told, Crawford replied. Mr. Blackwood, you've caused quite a stir in territorial circles. It's not often we hear of a half-breed lawyer taking on the local power structure to defend a freed slave's property rights. Jeremiah felt his stomach clench. In 1867, half-breed wasn't necessarily an insult from a federal official, but it was a reminder of his precarious position in society. Governor, Judge Hartwell interjected, there are circumstances here that require federal intervention. Crawford examined Solomon's manumission papers with the care of a man who understood their significance. These appear authentic, he said finally. Mr. Washington, you claim ownership of the land in Devil's Canyon? Yes, sir, Solomon said quietly. It's what my father died for, what he wanted his children to have. And Mr. Crenshaw attempted to force you to sign over those rights? He sent Thomas Brennan to intimidate me, Solomon confirmed. When I refused, Brennan drew his gun. I shot him in self-defense. Crawford turned to Sheriff Morrison, who was sweating despite the evening cool. Sheriff, What's your version of events? Morrison's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. Governor, I was told the boy murdered a white man in cold blood. I was just trying to maintain order. By organizing a lynch mob? Crawford's voice could have cut glass. Now see here, Governor. Augustus Crenshaw pushed through the crowd of deputies, his expensive suit rumpled and his face flushed with anger and alcohol. This is a local matter that's being blown out of proportion by outside agitators. Crawford's gaze settled on Crenshaw like a hawk eyeing a rabbit. Mr. Crenshaw, I presume? We've received some very interesting correspondence regarding your business practices. Crenshaw's face went pale. I don't know what you mean. Crawford reached into his coat and pulled out a telegram. This is from the federal mining inspector you've been bribing to falsify geological surveys. It seems he developed a conscience when he learned you were planning to murder a man for his land. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the sounds from outside seemed muted, as if the entire town was holding its breath. That's preposterous, Crenshaw blustered. We also have testimony from 3 of your associates who've agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity, Crawford continued relentlessly. They've provided detailed accounts of your conspiracy to defraud Mr. Washington of his legitimate property rights. Jeremiah felt a surge of vindication mixed with amazement. Governor, how did you know to come here? Crawford smiled grimly. Your letter, Mr. Blackwood. The one you sent to the Territorial Attorney General 3 weeks ago outlining the conspiracy and requesting federal intervention. It eventually found its way to my desk, along with copies of the geological surveys and evidence of mail fraud. I never sent any letter, Jeremiah said, confused. I did. Elizabeth stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. I've been corresponding with territorial officials for weeks, documenting the irregularities in the claims process and the obvious conspiracy against Mr. Washington. Her father stared at her in shock. Elizabeth, you could have been charged with interfering in a federal investigation, or commended for bringing federal crimes to the attention of proper authorities, Crawford said mildly. Miss Hartwell, your letters were quite persuasive, particularly your observations about the systematic exclusion of minority landowners from the local claims process. Augustus Crenshaw's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on purple. This is outrageous. You can't take the word of a nigger and a half-breed over respectable white citizens. The words were barely out of his mouth when Governor Crawford moved with surprising speed for a man his age. His hand cracked across Crenshaw's face with the sound of a gunshot, sending the larger man stumbling backward. Mr. Crenshaw, Crawford said in a voice like winter ice, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, bribery of federal officials, and violation of the civil rights of Mr. Solomon Washington. Sheriff Morrison, you are also under arrest for conspiracy and failure to uphold your oath of office. The room erupted into chaos. Morrison's deputies looked at each other uncertainly, unsure whether to draw their weapons against federal cavalry or surrender. Crenshaw was shouting threats and demands for his lawyer. Through it all, Solomon Washington sat in his chair like a man in a dream, unable to fully comprehend that justice had finally found him. Governor, Jeremiah said quietly, what happens now? Now, Mr. Blackwood, justice takes its course. Crawford's expression softened slightly. Mr. Washington will be escorted to Denver, where he'll formally register his land claim with federal authorities. Mr. Crenshaw and Sheriff Morrison will be tried in federal court for their crimes. And you? He paused, studying Jeremiah's face. You'll be offered a position as territorial prosecutor if you're willing to accept it. Jeremiah felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Sir? The territory needs lawyers who understand that justice isn't determined by the color of a man's skin or the thickness of his wallet, Crawford said. Your defense of Mr. Washington has shown remarkable courage and legal skill. The territorial government could use men like you. Before Jeremiah could respond, there was a commotion outside. Through the broken windows, they could see the townspeople gathering again, but this time their mood was different. Where before there had been hatred and bloodlust, now there was uncertainty and fear. Federal cavalry had a way of clarifying priorities. Citizens of Redemption Creek. Governor Crawford's voice carried across the courthouse square as he stepped onto the front steps. You have witnessed an attempt to subvert federal law and deny the legitimate rights of an American citizen. This will not be tolerated. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Mr. Solomon Washington is the rightful owner of 40 acres in Devil's Canyon, as confirmed by federal documentation and territorial law. Any attempt to interfere with his rights will be met with the full force of federal authority. The crowd murmured uneasily. Many of these same people had been ready to string Solomon up an hour ago, but the presence of federal troops and the arrest of their local power brokers had sobered them considerably. Furthermore, Crawford continued, I am announcing the appointment of Mr. Jeremiah Blackwood as Special Territorial Prosecutor, with full authority to investigate and prosecute civil rights violations throughout Colorado Territory. The announcement hit the crowd like a physical blow. A half-breed with federal authority, the implications were staggering. But then something unexpected happened. From the back of the crowd, an elderly Mexican man stepped forward. Jeremiah recognized him as Manuel Vasquez, a small rancher who'd been quietly fighting his own battle against land grabbers for years. Governor, Vasquez called out, his accented English carrying clearly across the square. This man Blackwood, he is good man. He helped my family when the bank tried to steal our ranch. He no take money, just want justice. A murmur ran through the crowd. Others began to speak up. A widow whose pension claim Jeremiah had filed, a Chinese merchant he'd defended against discriminatory taxes, a family of German immigrants he'd helped navigate the citizenship process. He helped us too, called out another voice. Never asked for nothing but what was right. Slowly, the mood of the crowd began to shift. These weren't wealthy landowners or corrupt officials. These were ordinary people who'd seen Jeremiah's character in action over the years. They might not understand federal law or civil rights, but they understood fairness and decency. Governor Crawford watched this transformation with interest. It seems, Mr. Blackwood, that you have more support in this community than you realized. Jeremiah looked out at the faces in the crowd, some hostile, some uncertain, but many showing the first glimmers of respect. For years, he'd lived as an outsider, neither fully accepted nor completely rejected. Now, for the first time, he was seeing himself through different eyes. I accept the appointment, he said quietly, then raised his voice so the crowd could hear. I accept the responsibility to uphold federal law and protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of their race, religion, or place of birth. The cheers that rose from the crowd weren't universal, but they were real. And for Solomon Washington, sitting in the courthouse behind them, they represented something he'd never dared hope for, acceptance as an equal under the law. As the sun set over Redemption Creek, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the federal cavalry began making camp on the edge of town. Tomorrow, they would escort Solomon to Denver to formalize his land claim. Tomorrow, Augustus Crenshaw and Sheriff Morrison would begin their journey to federal prison. Tomorrow, Jeremiah Blackwood would begin his new role as a territorial prosecutor. But tonight, as the three men sat in Judge Hartwell's office sharing a bottle of whiskey and planning their next moves, the weight of history pressed down on them. They had witnessed something remarkable, a moment when justice had triumphed over prejudice, when federal law had protected the powerless against the powerful, when the promise of equality had been more than just words on parchment. Mr. Blackwood, Solomon said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know how to thank you. You already have, Jeremiah replied. You stood up for yourself when it would have been easier to give in. You proved that courage isn't about the color of your skin. It's about the content of your character. Elizabeth, who had been quietly observing their conversation, spoke up. Father, what will happen to the mining rights? Judge Hartwell looked at Solomon. That's up to Mr. Washington. He's the legal owner. Solomon was quiet for a long moment, staring into his whiskey glass. $2 million, he said finally. More money than I ever dreamed of. More than enough to live like a king anywhere in the country, Jeremiah agreed. Or, Solomon said slowly, enough to do something that really matters. He looked up at them, his eyes bright with possibility. What if we used that money to build something? A school for children who don't have one. A hospital for folks who can't afford a doctor. A place where it doesn't matter if you're black or white or anything in between, just whether you need help. Elizabeth's face lit up. Solomon, that's a wonderful idea. It's also a dangerous one, Jeremiah warned. There are people who won't want to see that kind of change. Then we'll just have to be ready for them, Solomon said with a grin that transformed his gaunt features. Besides, I've got me a fancy federal prosecutor friend now. I reckon that might come in handy. They talked long into the night, planning and dreaming and building something bigger than any of them could have imagined that morning. By dawn, the framework of a foundation had taken shape, an organization dedicated to providing education, medical care, and legal assistance to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay or the color of their skin. 3 months. Later, Governor Crawford returned to Redemption Creek for the dedication of the Washington Community Foundation. The ceremony took place on Solomon's land in Devil's Canyon, where the first buildings were already under construction. A school that would accept children of all races. A medical clinic staffed by doctors who'd sworn to treat anyone who needed care. A legal aid office where Jeremiah would provide free services to those who couldn't afford a lawyer. The crowd that gathered for the dedication was different from the mob that had once called for Solomon's blood. Federal oversight and the very real threat of prosecution had dampened the enthusiasm of the most ardent racists. But more importantly, Solomon's generosity had won over many hearts that might have remained closed forever. My father always told me, Solomon said as he addressed the crowd, that the measure of a man isn't what he accumulates but what he gives away. Today I'm giving away most of my fortune to build something that will outlast all of us. A place where every person is valued, where every child can learn, where every family can find help when they need it most. When he finished speaking, Governor Crawford stepped forward. The governor's next action would be talked about for generations in Colorado territory. He knelt down in the dust before Solomon Washington, took the freed slave's hands in his own, and kissed them. Solomon Washington, Crawford said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, you have shown us what true nobility looks like, not the nobility of birth or wealth, but the nobility of character and service. The image burned itself into the memory of everyone present. A white governor, the representative of federal authority, kneeling before a black man in an act of respect and recognition that turned the social order upside down. But perhaps even more powerful was what happened next. One by one, other members of the crowd began to follow Crawford's example. Manuel Vasquez was the first, followed by the German immigrant family Jeremiah had helped, then the Chinese merchant, then the widow with the pension claim. Not everyone joined them. Some slipped away, unable or unwilling to accept this new reality. But enough remained to send a clear message, that Redemption Creek was changing, that the old ways of hatred and exclusion were giving way to something better. As the sun set, over the mountains that evening, Jeremiah Blackwood stood with Elizabeth Hartwell on a ridge overlooking the construction site. They had been married the week before, their wedding attended by a congregation that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Blacks and whites, Indians and Mexicans, rich and poor, all gathered to celebrate not just their union but the broader transformation of their community. Do you think it will last? Elizabeth asked, her hand in his as they watched the workers putting the finishing touches on the school's foundation. The buildings? Jeremiah replied. Probably. The idea behind them, that's harder to say. But worth fighting for? Jeremiah thought about the journey that had brought them here, the spit on his face, the threats and violence, the moment when justice had seemed impossible and death had seemed certain. He thought about Solomon's courage, and Elizabeth's determination and Governor Crawford's moral clarity. He thought about the children who would attend the school they were building, regardless of their parents' race or wealth. Yes, he said finally. It's worth fighting for. In the distance, they could see Solomon directing the placement of a stone marker at the entrance to the foundation grounds. The inscription, carved in letters deep enough to last for centuries, read simply, "Justice is not a destination, but A journey we take together. The words would outlive all of them, outlive the buildings they were constructing, outlive the hatreds and prejudices that had brought them to this moment. But perhaps more importantly, they would outlive the fear that had once convinced good people that justice was too dangerous to pursue and too costly to defend. As darkness settled over Devil's Canyon, lanterns were lit throughout the construction site, their warm glow pushing back the shadows. In the morning, the work would continue. Schools would be built, children would be educated, the sick would be healed, and justice would be served. The dream that had begun with spit on a courthouse step and ended with a governor's kiss would take root and grow, spreading far beyond the boundaries of one small Colorado town. And somewhere in those dancing lights, in the sound of hammers and saws, in the laughter of children who would never know a world where their worth was determined by their skin color, the future was being born. Have you ever had to choose between love and wealth? Between standing up for what's right and taking the easy path? We want to hear your story. Share in the comments below how you faced difficult choices involving family, money, and moral courage. Your experience might inspire our next video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. This community values courage, justice, and the right of every person to defend what's theirs, even when the price is high. Together, we're building something that matters, a place where truth wins over power, where character matters more than color, and where standing up for others isn't just brave, it's necessary.